Hey friends! All right. So what we're going to be working on today is looking at what I think is one of the most important parts of acoustics. What we're going to look at now is getting into this idea of reverberation, or we say it's reverb, or just sometimes verb. What we're looking at is going to be, I don't know, one of the most, I guess, one of the most like noticeable aspects of acoustics. So when you walk into a room, I mean, the term that most people will use is echoey. You know, I've kind of poked fun at that a little bit over the semester a little bit, but basically, what like I would say general public will usually call stuff is they're gonna say this is like it's really echoey in here, and what they really mean by reverberation. So reverberation is one of the key defining characteristics of a room or a space. So when you walk into a room, you're gonna really get it gives you a sense of feel. So when we talk about these things of like tuning rooms, of course, tuning rooms don't you can't tune a room. Room doesn't actually make any sound by itself, but it does react to sound, and the way it does react is usually in regards to its reverb. So when we describe the way a room sounds, we'll say something like it's a warm sounding room, or it's a wooden sounding room, or bright sounding room, or dark sounding room, or cold or warm. You know, we've got these different kind of subjective descriptors that are usually not attributed to sound per se, which is kind of interesting. Usually they're attributed to other things that we associate when we talk about sound. And a lot of that has to do like when I say a warm room or a wooden room or something like that, it's got a really metallic sound to it. So metallic isn't a sound. It's a material, right? Or warm or cold, that's not a sound, that's a temperature. Or when we say it's like bright or dark, that's a visual cue. But yet we're able to associate those with sound. And so kind of what we want to look at here is when we say we associate with sound, what we're doing is a lot of times we're describing actually the reverberation characteristics of a room. So what we want to be able to do, well, maybe not all the way through, but just start to get an appreciation of when I say something is dark or warm or bright or harsh or something along those lines, what that really means in terms of that, especially in terms of reverberation. So like I said, reverberation is one of the most characteristic attributes of acoustics that we deal with. And when you're tuning a room, what you're doing a lot of times is you're going in and you're working with the reverb characteristics of this. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna break this up into two different classes today. So this is because this section warrants 2 days worth of lecture for this chapter, and even then, it's still gonna be a lot of material. So what we're gonna look at first on this first now is we're gonna look at basically calculation of reverb time. So we're gonna look at how like sound grows and dies out in a room, and we're gonna talk about calculating reverb time. So essentially, this is all well and fine. This is like we'll get through this stuff pretty quick. This is what I want to spend most of the time on here is this notion of calculating reverb time. So what we're gonna start doing is building up models of acoustic models of rooms, and that's kind of what we're like kind of going towards as we move along through the semester here is we want to be able to predict how how a room is going to sound, which then also will allow you to be able to treat it. And so when I can predict it and then I can predict the treatment, that saves a lot of money and potential time and potential money, I guess. But then what we're going to do is we're going to look at next class, we're going to look at measuring reverb and now analyzing reverb. So I'm doing, I guess, a reverb analysis. So today's gonna be focused on just understanding what reverb is and then how we model it. And the next class is gonna be how we actually measure it. And then we kind of combine those two together and go, okay, how do we treat a room when we're looking for it? And we have to look for the ideal characteristics of a space. So let's do it. Let's get into it. So let's talk about this idea of reverberation. So it's kind of like the primary descriptor of how a room sounds. So like I said, a room doesn't actually make any sound, but when you make a sound in a room, like say with a violin or singing voice or drum set or whatever kind of noise, it's going to react to that, and we're gonna have reflections. We've spent some time on reflection so far and understanding, and also in terms of diffusion. So diffusion is one of our key tools. So when we talk about reverberation, depending on what we're going for, whether we want to what we want the room to sound like, we can either remove energy or keep energy in the room. So to remove energy is going to be absorption. To keep energy in the room is diffusion. So we've already talked a little bit about diffusion. That's when we want to keep energy in the room. And then absorption is when we're going to take it out of the room. We're going to start talking about absorption a little bit today when we start talking about absorption coefficients. But we're going to be dealing more with that a lot later, especially for low frequency stuff. But yeah, I guess it's one of the primary factors in determining the quality of a room. So quality, of course, is a subjective term. It can mean, quality is good or bad or how it sounds. We don't always necessarily mean quality being good or bad. It could also mean just how does it sound? How do you describe the sound of this thing? Okay, so let's define it. So reverberation. So so I'm gonna go through this. Basically, sound takes time for energy to dissipate. We're gonna go through this fairly explicitly here, and we'll get a pretty good grip on this. So the time, the lag in which the energy is decaying out of a room, that's what we call reverberation. So up to this point, we've already discussed in fairly explicit detail that sound is an energy. So what we're doing is this energy is going to be built up in this room and it's going to decay out of this room. And so that decay or that time lag is what we call reverberation. And what it does on a perceptual level is it gives you this sense of envelopment. So if you go watch, say, a classical concert, you're usually in these a fairly reverberant hall, and when the musicians are up on stage playing, it's bouncing around the room and filling up the room with energy, with that sound energy, and that sound energy is bouncing back all over the room, and it gives you that sense of envelopment. And that sense of envelopment is something that we actually kind of like, and so it gives us that feeling of being like, yeah, enveloped in the sound, and that's something that we really like. And so we oftentimes now will actually add fake reverb to our recordings to give it that quality of sound, to make it sound like we're in that space, being enveloped. And so it gives you that emotional association with being in a space. So that's why we use like fake reverbs or like, plugins as reverbs. So we'll talk a little bit about this here, but each reflection is weaker due to absorption and transmission. So when sound is bouncing around a room, every time it reflects off a surface, so we talked a little bit about this on reflection, but maybe just a little bit. Every time it bounces and every time it hits a surface, it's going to reflect, but it's going to lose energy. And some of that energy either gets absorbed into the material that it's reflecting off of. So it could be something soft like, acoustic foam, or something hard like concrete. Or if it's something like glass, it's actually going to transmit through. So it's going to actually leak out of the room. So the transmission is another way. It's actually like we lose energy in the room, is that it goes out and never comes back. And we'll talk more about that with absorption coefficients here in just a couple minutes. And then actually air itself does provide some absorption, particularly at the high frequencies. And that's also going to be another little element that we're going to twist, that we're going to add in here, is that when we talk about this notion of energy bouncing around in the room, what we're also saying is that it's actually frequency dependent. And so that's what gives rise to this notion of how a room sounds, is how fast it's absorbing different frequencies at different rates. And we've kind of mentioned that before, like a little bit, or a few classes ago, but we're really going to dig into that a little bit more and get pretty good at that sort of stuff. And also, path lengths and room shape make a difference. So like the size of the room, the length of the room, and the shape of the room are all going to affect the sound of that, and the way that the sound and energy bounce around in the room and get absorbed. So those are all going to determine kind of the quality of sound in there. And then the other thing, the important thing to hear, is that energy decays at an exponential rate. So we'll see that. I mean, that's not really that important, but it's just it's good to know that it decays at an exponential rate, because that'll give rise to us when we're looking at plots, knowing that it's actually going to come, like it's going to plot as a straight line. Because if it comes on an exponential rate, and we plot it on a logarithmic scale, like we do with like in other words, if you use decibels, it's going to look like a straight line. So, because remember, decibels use a logarithmic scale, an exponential scale, so therefore it's going to appear as a straight line. Cool. All right, so let's talk about, we're going to break this down and talk about like the way sound grows in a room, the sound decays in a room, and then we're going to do some math on this stuff. I know. I said we're not going to be doing a lot of math. The math we're doing here isn't very hard, but it is tedious. It's very tedious, but I'll walk you through it a few times. Okay, so let's talk about growth of sound in a room. So what we're going to do is we're going to start, let's use an example here. So like add constant sound energy into a space. So in other words, if I use something like a speaker, so if I turn on a speaker with just playing pink noise, and you can try this on your own, just fire up some pink noise in there. What you'll find is that the energy, as I turn it up, the energy is going to start bouncing around in the room, and it fills the room with energy, with sound energy. But at a certain point, as it fills this room with energy, it starts to decay, and it decays at the same rate at which we're adding the energy in the room. Otherwise, it keeps getting louder and louder and louder and louder. So we know this, it reaches a steady state because it, like as I set the gain or volume on a knob, on our like volume knob or master fader or whatever you're using, that the energy fills the room and it doesn't continue to get louder and louder. Like I'm trying to think, like the equivalent would be something like water, filling a glass with water. You fill it up, but then at a certain point, it's going to start like draining the water at the same rate that you're filling it up. I mean, that's a tough analogy. That's actually a pretty crappy analogy. So disregard that one. But what I'm saying here is though that the energy is being dissipated, and so when I say dissipated, the energy is getting lost in the room. It's usually being absorbed or transmitted at the same rate at which it's being created. So, and that's what we call, the term for that is called steady state. So we reach a steady state there. So yeah, energy is being dissipated at the same rate as being produced. So, and yeah, again, that's something that we just kind of know intuitively, but that's a pretty good term to know. It's like this notion of steady state. So let's look at this like in a graphical situation, how this might work. So what we've got here is we've got a sound source denoted by S, and we've got our listener over here. This is straight from the book, by the way. And we've got a person sitting on a chair here. And what we're like, so let's focus on this graphic for a second, and then we'll talk about what's going on down here. So as we go down here, we've got the direct sound. So the direct sound is going to take the shortest amount of time and go straight to the person. And yeah, we just go there. So we have R2, which is going to be our first reflection. And we're going to talk more about this next class, also with this notion of synthetic reverbs. We talk about first reflections and early reflections and the reverberant tails and stuff. But we'll deal with that later. But what we see here is that on this one right here, we have a bounce, an R2. So if we were to take a look at the energy in the room, so here's what the sound pressure is. So from time 0, it's going to go, we have this direct sound right here. And now, well, they have R1. So R1 is going to be the shortest path because they're saying that they're closer to the ceiling right here. So this is maybe like a PA speaker hanging up or something like that. This R1 is going to do a single bounce. And as a result, it's going to add energy into the room. So we have our D, which is our direct sound. And then we have R plus R1. So it's going to hop up over here. So that's going to be our energy here. And then, of course, we're going to have our R2, which is going to come soon after that because it's right after R1. It has to go slightly farther length. If we measure the length of this arrow versus this one, it's going to be a little bit longer. So we see here, it's now going to be D plus R1 plus R2. And then we see that like for it to get to R3, it's going to be a third bounce. It's going to bounce all the way over here to this room, this one here. And so we see D plus R plus 1, R1 plus R2 plus R3. So that's going to step up. And then actually R4 is just about the same as that. So it's going to be this one right here. Now, we're breaking this down in like single bounces right there. But in real life, there's like, hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions, you could say almost infinite number of reflections that happen there. But they all take time. And so it happens in a stepwise fashion here, but it happens so quickly that it smears to our ear. It's going to sound more like this curve right here. So that's it's basically going to like curve up like this and build up until all of the sound is like bouncing all over the room, and it builds it up. And so, but what I was saying there before is that every time it bounces, it loses a bit of energy. So that because of the absorption materials on the different surfaces, like even if it's concrete floor and you have gypsum or drywall walls and ceilings, the reflected sound is not 100%. It's actually a reduced amplitude. Which is also why when we see this D right here, this D is like 2 units. I don't know what they're saying, 2 units. That the R1 is much smaller. After it's reflected, the amplitude of that is a lot smaller right there. And of course, these are like going to be our first reflections, but we're going to have secondary reflections and third and tertiary. I guess I can't remember the term for them right now, but you're going to have like multiples. So it's going to bounce here, bounce here, bounce here, bounce here, bounce here. And of course, every time it does that, it reduces its amplitude based off of whatever the material is, and it's going to get reduced. So eventually it's going to hit what we call a steady state, and it no longer gets any louder in a room. So this is what we call growth of sound in a room. So let's talk about decay of sound in a room. So decay, and this actually correlates back to that same image that we just had right there. So we have our direct sound, and then our second one. So the sound pressure, the reflections right here, you can see that each reflection right here, it's smaller in amplitude. So every time it reflects, it reduces in amplitude. So over the course of time, it's going to reduce. Actually, this is probably not the right plot for this, but it's getting reduced over time. So every time it reflects, it's going to reduce. And so therefore, after a certain number of reflections, it completely dissipates down to like no sound. And it doesn't go to no sound. I mean, it does go down to no sound in terms of the sound source. It doesn't like completely vanish. There's still just sound, usually ambient sound in the room, like that comes from HVAC, computers, people breathing, that kind of stuff. So you won't be able, it's very rare that you get to like an absolute kind of quiet room. We talk about things like anechoic chambers. We'll talk more about that when we talk about absorption. But An anechoic chamber is a room where you try to remove all ambient and reflective sound in there. So you're hearing just the source and no reflective. But that's usually a bad place to do like recordings. You don't want to actually do a record in an anechoic space. You need to have some energy in the space. Um, yeah. Okay. I'm just thinking of other things that we can discuss with that, but I think we're gonna save those discussions for a little bit later. Okay, so let's talk about idealized growth and decay of sound in a space. So, like we said, it's actually a stepwise phenomenon, but we tend to perceive it as a smooth. Like that's that stair stepping I was talking about. Every reflection acts as a stair step, but we perceive it as a smooth thing right here. So this is basically where the direct sound, and then we're adding in all of our reflections, but then it ends up rounding off over here, and it hits what we call steady state. So this is plotted on a linear scale. This is plotted on a logarithmic scale. So this is just linear sound pressure. This is sound pressure in decibel. So therefore, this is on I guess an exponential scale, we could say. Or well, it's a logarithmic scale, but it behaves exponentially. So we turn on a speaker, it fills the room, and then it hits steady state. And then when I turn off the speaker, as soon as I turn off the speaker, it takes time for that energy to dissipate, for it to go away. And if we plot on a linear scale, it's going to look like this. But on a log scale, which is what we usually do, we mostly plot sound levels in terms of pressure. It's going to drop off as a straight line right here. And I said, this is important. Note that this is all frequencies combined. So this is just regular energy. What we're going to do is we're going to build our model to get more sophisticated, and it's going to be frequency dependent. So not all frequency decay at the same rate. We've seen about that. We've talked about that a little bit already so far, but that we're going to dig into that pretty hardcore today. So this is essentially, yeah. So the old school model of this is going to be basically not old school model, but the model for this is we add energy into a room, we stop the energy, and it takes time for it to decay. Cool. Let's start doing some things like with calculation of reverb. So what we want to be able to do is we want to, like as acousticians, we want to be able to predict how a room is going to sound before we actually build it. And so we can basically and I guess I will say that there's no such thing as ideal reverb, although we'll talk a little bit about ideal reverb. We'll try and bring that into the discussion, but there's not one kind of reverb that's good for all situations. For something like classical music, it's going to have a different reverb quality than something like in a space that's going to have spoken word, or that's going to be in a space that's maybe like an electronic venue, or a living room, or different spaces are going to be used for different purposes, and you want different amounts of reverb time. So we want to be able to calculate and predict how this is going to work before we actually spend any money on materials, and before we start. Yeah, I guess that's really it. Spending a lot of money on this thing, so we can predict how it's going to work. But that kind of brings us back to this dude, Wallace Sabine. So it was a Harvard physicist in the 1960s, and he was kind of like he's credited as being the pioneer. People have been doing acoustics work for a long time, but he was really the one who really formalized the acoustic process and measurement. And so he studied the relationship between area, volume, and absorption materials, which up to that point, it was kind of a crapshoot. Basically, as the story goes, as I've heard it, is that basically that at Harvard, they built this brand new lecture hall. And when we're talking about acoustical architecture, we talk about architecture. So when we talk about architecture, acoustic was not really part of the consideration. I mean, it's in there, but most of architecture was designed for aesthetics and for lighting and comfortable, seating and that kind of stuff. They didn't really address acoustics just because it wasn't really well understood. People didn't know how to predict acoustics. So what they would do is they would design something that looked pretty and that was comfortable, and that, you could see everybody, and however the halls were designed at that time. And same thing goes for concert halls, or for any kind of space that we would say a critical listening environment. So I would say a critical listening environment for something like a lecture hall, where and this is before electricity. I mean, I guess the 1890s is right when electricity started showing up, but not in real form did we start using electricity in the classroom until probably last decade. Maybe 20 years ago, I guess. But before that, the way they would do it is a lecture hall would be just a professor sitting up front or standing up front and spouting out to the audience. And what you want to do when you have a spoken word, or you can imagine this being in a church venue, same sort of idea, where you have somebody who's speaking and they want to address a lot of people. What we want to do is there's a balance. We want to fill the energy in the room with the person's voice, so that it actually fills the energy of the room so you can have a lot of people, even in the back row, be able to hear what they're saying. So we want the energy to stay in the room, but we need it to die out fast enough that between syllables, it's not hanging on for too long that they can't, that their dialogue is getting garbled, because between syllables, it needs to die out fast enough. So in other words, we don't want it to be completely reverberant. Otherwise, it just becomes like a reverberant mess. It's just like, you can't understand what they're saying. So there's this weird balance, or not weird, but I would say delicate balance for an acoustic lecture hall, where you want to be able to like have the voice die off fast enough that you can understand every word, but stick around long enough that it fills the energy with the room with energy. So that's kind of the challenge here. So what ended up happening is with Harvard, they built this lecture hall, and they, I guess what I'm thinking about is like, this is also what makes it like designing churches, like analog churches, a challenge, because they're used for both music, where you want a lot of reverb, and for spoken word, where you want moderate reverb. So that's a bit of a challenge. Modern churches and mega churches is not such a big deal, because you have microphones, and so you can actually add reverb in if you want to, and have a deader room to give it that sense of envelopment without having to rely on the natural acoustics of a space. But again, as the story goes, they built this lecture hall and it sounded like garbage. So they're like, why? Like, why is this like this? And so they brought Sabine in and goes like, I think I can try and take a crack at this and try and figure this thing out. So what he did is himself and a bunch of grad students went in and they started popping balloons with stopwatches, like the old school analog stopwatches. And what they would do is they would pop balloons, start and stop. And they basically go from a balloon pop where I can hear the reverb tail of it to where I can't hear it anymore. How long does that take? So that's essentially what they did. And what he found through like just some good insight and good just head scratching was that there's like I said here, it's a relationship between surface area, volume, like room volume, and absorption materials. So those are the kind of the three defining factors and so that's what we're going to use for class today. It's this thing called Sabine's formula. But it's kind of interesting. Like, this is also like, when you think about like big fancy concert halls back in the day, there's certain concert halls, like old school concert halls, that have a certain aesthetic that people love about them. Like, this is a great hall, this is a bad concert hall. And again, prior to the early 1900s, people would just build halls and cross their fingers and hope that it sounded good. And now, of course, if you're investing a lot of money into these things, like, you want it to sound good before you dump money into these things. And so there's lots of like engineering examples of bad like concert halls. So and again, it's because they didn't have any formal acoustics prior to that time, that they would just kind of build it and hope it worked. So yeah, so that's basically how what we want to be able to do here. So like the term for this, so what came out of Sabine's studies was this thing called what we call RT60. So we're going to focus on this in horrific detail for this. So RT60 stands for reverberation time, and 60. So RT60 is the time it takes for the sound energy to drop 60 decibels. So if we want to think about that, that's like basically complete arbitrary value, but we needed a standard, so this was picked. And we think about back when Sabine was probably popping balloons, popping a balloon from super loud, like it's about the range for it to go from really loud to inaudible. So let's think about this. So if we wanted to go from so knowing what we know about decibels up to this point, yes, we're still talking about decibels, but now we have a little sense of scale what they are. So if we're talking about something like a balloon pop, so a big balloon pop could be upwards of 100 decibels. So 100 decibels is pretty loud, right? So so if it goes from really loud, say 100 decibels, down to decaying down to say 40 decibels. So 60 dB drop would be going from 100 decibels down to 40 decibels. And at 40 decibels, that's about probably the noise floor of a quiet room. Like say we're in a concert hall, not even concert hall, we'll say a lecture hall, of a classroom or a lecture hall that has nobody in it, that's really quiet. We're going to have an HVAC system in there. And to be honest, actually 40 is pretty low. 50, like if I have a classroom full of people, that hovers around 55 dB. If everybody's being really as quiet as they can be in a classroom full of people, it's still gonna be around 55 decibels, more or less. But we'll just say that, like, if you were all alone in a room, and this is probably the 1890s when there's not a whole lot of HVAC systems right there, they just used passive heating and cooling. Maybe. Yeah, because I guess they didn't have electricity at the time. So it was all passive heating and cooling. That it would be pretty quiet in that room as long as there's nobody else around. So if you were in that room late at night, you could get it down to about 40 decibels. The room itself is just going to have some just creaking and people breathing in a room is gonna cause it to the noise floor to be, we'll just say around 40 decibels. Just use that as an example. So the result is we go from 100 decibels down to 40 decibels. So that's what we call inaudible, because the tail goes below the noise floor, and therefore we can't hear it anymore. Even though the energy is still bouncing around in there, the noise floor of the room masks that, so that we no longer, the noise floor of the room becomes the dominant or predominant sound. So basically 60 decibel drop goes from really loud to really quiet, or I guess inaudible. Yeah, so 100 dB is loud sound, so 40 dB in noise floor of quiet spaces right there. So that's a pretty good example. And I just sit there, I'm blown away that they figured all this stuff out with analog stopwatches, man, and balloons. That's crazy. That's just wild. So that's just wild. So in real world, it's really difficult to get this entire range. So like I mentioned right there, so if we were going from say 100 decibels down to say the noise floor being 55 decibels of a floor space, that means you don't actually have an entire 60 dB range or differential that you can work with there. So you have a couple options. One is that I could use an even louder source. So if I put something up to 110 or even 120 decibels, like a balloon pop, actually you can probably get a balloon pop won't go that loud. You'd have to do something like a cannon shot or something like that to really like excite the room up to 100 decibels and then drop it out. So that's going to be pretty tough to do. So what we can do though is we can extrapolate. That's the cool thing about that straight line that we were talking about before, that even if it goes to the noise floor, we can still extrapolate. And we'll do some examples of that here. So the real world's in difficult to the entire range. So we can extrapolate using the slope if needed, but it's still better to get the full range if you can. All right, so this is what I'm talking about right here. So there's a number of different ways we can do these kind of measurements. So I was just talking about using the balloon pop right there. So we can use an impulse. So an impulse is interesting because what it does, it releases all the energy at the same time. And it just sends boom. So an impulse is all frequencies, all energy at the same time going in all directions. And so that's how we excite the room. We listen to all this energy that goes out and it bounces around the room and comes back, and we listen to the tail that comes off of it. The other one is what we can do is doing like a steady state measurement. So where basically I turn on a speaker blasting pink or white noise, and then I turn off that pink or white noise. And so that's kind of what we're showing right here. This is a steady state one. So in this case, what we're doing is we're playing along at say 100 decibels right here at like with a pink noise generator, really loud speakers going in a space. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it off. And as soon as I turn it off, the energy is going to start decaying. And you'll notice again, we're on decibels here. So this is going to show up as a straight line because it's exponential decay. And then it's going to come down here, and then eventually it's going to hit this noise floor right here. So in this case right here, they're calling this as being what, 20? A noise floor of a room of about 20, 22 decibels right there. That's a really stinking quiet room, but it's possible for sure. So in this case, what we're looking at here is the time it takes for it to go from 100 decibels down 60 dB below that, which of course would be 40 decibels. So how long does this time take right here? That's what we're looking for right here. And in this case right here, say we have a room that has this room has like a 56 or 58 dB noise floor, because it's just like maybe it's got an HVAC system in there or something like that going on, where it's just like a lot of people or something like that, traffic noise from outside. It just creates a lot of ambient sound. So this is our noise floor of just the room, that even though if I make something at 100 dB, it's going to come off as a straight line, and then it's going to level out stuff out here. But we can take a straight line and draw this down and imagine that this is going to keep going down, because even though this noise floor is here, actually this energy is decaying below the noise floor. It's still energy bouncing around the room as a result of the sound source, but it's going to be dropping off right there. So we can use this again as an extrapolation right there. So let's do one of these. Since we're not doing this live, we're not going to be actually doing clickers right here, but this is if we want to do this as a clicker. So what's the RT60 of the following? So it says right here, subtract the start time from the final time. So basically, maybe I start this stopwatch or whatever, not stopwatch, but I start this counter right here. So this is time 0. So we're going to go all the way along right here, and we're going to turn off at whatever, 0.4 seconds, because it's really fast. So at 0.4 seconds, it starts to decay. And then as it goes down, we look at, it hits the noise floor over here. So this is me trying to do some crappy drawings. This is a lot harder to draw than you think in Keynote here. This took me a long time. So it's going to drop off right here. And of course, I'm drawing these as hard lines. This is actually going to be really fuzzy. But this is the noise floor of our room, saying it's about 20 dB for a noise floor. So what we care about right here is from here to here. So this is the 60 dB mark right here. So if we start at 95 decibels, we need to go down to 35 decibels for 60 dB. And so we draw that across here, and then that's where we have. So if we look at this, we see, well, if we call this the starting time and this the ending time. It takes 1 second. So it's 1.4 minus 0.4. So subtract the start time from the final time. And we get so it's one, in this case, it's going to be 1 second reverb time. Yeah. So that means it goes boom, boom. So like that's about, well, more or less 1 second right there. That's how long it takes the energy to drop 60 dB. So that's kind of cool. Thinking about that, we can think about this in terms of real numbers. Like we can hear this energy decay in a room. And the room I'm in right now, this is my mastering room space. It's super dead in here, so it's not really that live. But if you go into, say, a parking garage or a stairwell or a large bathroom, like your home bathroom is a little bit too small, and we'll see why that is. Like the larger the space, it's going to have a longer reverb time. But a 1 second reverb time is a fairly tight reverb time. So it's a long reverb time if you're recording vocals, but it's a short reverb time maybe if you're recording drums. Or it's a really short if you're recording something like classical and you want that really long reverb tail. So generally speaking, we're going to see stuff on the scale of between, let's say, 0.5 and 2.5 seconds. That's going to be like kind of our real world ranges of reverb times. And again, I think it's also important to show here that this is what we're talking about here is all of the energy at the same time. We're not talking about high versus low frequencies. We're just saying all the energy. So we need to bring that into the loop here. So here's another one. What is the RT60 of the following? So in other words, we did it 80, and I should have chosen larger numbers than this, but I did it as an 80 dB. So for me to go to 80 dB, if I have an 80 dB sound source, that I need to get down to, so it's playing along and it turns it off, that I need to get this down to 80 goes all the way down to 20. Well, the noise floor of this room is, say, at 40. So therefore, I have to extrapolate where it would have gone down to be 60 dB differential. In this case right here, so if we say this is 0.5, or wait, this is 0.4, this is 0.6, and this is 1.2, that it's going to be a reverb time of about 0.7. Yeah, I guess it's about, this is 0.468, this is 6, 1.2, it should be 0.6. I don't know why I have 0.7 right there. That's wrong. It should be 0.6, right? Because if it's, the start time is 0.6, I think thought this was I don't know why I thought that was. So this is a little bit wrong. So that's supposed to be 0.6 because 1.2 minus 0.6 is 0.6. So that's our 60 dB differential right there. Cool. All right. Here's another interesting kind of concept with this, what we call RT60. So RT60, we can say that human hearing is most sensitive to the first or 20 or 30 dB drop. So you'll hear things called the RT30 and the RT20. Are oftentimes used. In fact, when we use Room EQ Wizard, a lot of times it'll give it to you in the RT20 and RT30. There's a little bit more information that goes along with that, but we're not going to get into that for right now. So most of the time, just because of tradition, we call it RT60. So the RT30 is technically half of RT60, and RT20 is technically 1/3 of RT60. So it doesn't really matter. But what we're saying here is that RT30 is important because that's the really important part. The long little tail at the end, we don't really care about that quite so much. We care about the first drop off that first 30 dB drop. That's where we really notice it is in terms of human perception. So even if we hear it in terms of RT30, we'll still usually discuss this in terms of RT60. So when you say what's the reverb time of a room, what's the RT60 of a room, we're talking about RT60, and so that's usually what the term we're going to use. All right, now let's go another layer deeper with this. What we want to do is use Sabine's equation. This is like I said, it's math. But it's not hard math, but it's very tedious math. And, well, I'll go ahead and pull it up. So this is it right here. RT60 equals KV over A. This is kind of the original one. And we're gonna go a little bit deeper right with this right now. But this is kind of, it's like core equation right here. So RT60 equals KV over A. And so what we're to kind of define what this is the volume of a room. This is the absorptive area of a room. They call absorption, they call them Sabines. But this needs a little more description right here. And then K is what we have as a relational constant. So, and this will become a little bit more clear in a minute here because this is essentially surface area times absorption coefficient. This is volume. So what we're seeing here is that there's going to be a relation between volume and surface area. And what we need is what we call a relational constant. And this is what the magic of what Sabine figured out. And we call this thing essentially a constant. So in imperial terms, we call K as 0.049. So in a lot of physics, we tend to use K as a constant, K for constant. If anybody saw the South Park, the QAnon South Park one where they were community kids with a K, hilarious. So anyway, But same thing kind of happens with it with you can think of it like German spelling of constant. Like we use like we tend to use k a lot in physics as a placeholder for a constant value. So and I'm like there's actually a value like a dimension associated with it, but we're going to brush that under the rug. We're not going to have to go that far and that deep with it. But again, we call this k is 0.49 on this one, and that's always the case if you're working in cubic feet. And this one, if you're working in cubic meters, it's 0.161. So that is just all you need to know is that is because I'm going to be doing everything in well, pretty much everything in metric, just because that's the way the world should be. You've heard me go off on it, but I'm gonna stick with metric right now. But I think the book uses everything in feet, just because it was written by an American. But this is what we're looking at here. So volume is in the numerator, and then surface area times the absorption coefficients, which was what we're going to call sabines, in the denominator. Don't worry yet. We're gonna get into more of the equation here. We're gonna run through it a few times. So let's talk about this notion of absorption coefficients. So a coefficient, if like in mathematical terms or scientific terms, a coefficient means just a number. It's a dimensionless number. And what it does, it's like how heavy or how important, or it's like when we say a coefficient, it's just like it's an associated number. So what we can say here is a perfect absorber has a coefficient of 1. So a perfect absorber, like if I had my window open out, if it was open out to an open field and I had my window open, we can imagine that window being a perfect absorber, meaning if sound was going to go along and hit this like open window, it's going to escape out the window and never come back. That energy is gone. It's lost. It's a perfect absorber. So the surface area of that open window would be considered a perfect absorber. Absorbs all the energy. A perfect reflector has a coefficient of 0. So there is no such thing as a perfect reflector, but we can get pretty dang close. If we talk about something like really, really hard sealed concrete, that's going to reflect a lot or most of the energy that comes off of it. So it's going to have like concrete is going to have a very low absorption coefficient, and things that if we imagine other materials, like these soft things like acoustic foam or carpets or like curtains and that kind of stuff, those are going to have pretty high absorption coefficients. So and they approach 1. And then as something that's really reflective is going to be a 0. So we can kind of think of those as a percentage. So if you want to think this is 0%, so how much sound is it absorbing? 0%. And if we think of this as a percentage, this is 100% right here. So we can kind of correlate these to percentages, and we'll use that as kind of a rule of thumb going forward here. Now here's the other thing that's really important is that they're frequency dependent. So absorption coefficients are not just one absorption coefficient, but it's per frequency. So per frequency range. I mean, truthfully, it's a spectrum of like infinite number of frequencies. But what we're going to look at it is we're going to constrain this down to between I think it's 125 up to 104 kilohertz. Sorry, 125 to 4 kilohertz. And yeah, well let's take a look at some of these right here. So this is pulled off of the back of the book. So let's actually just to show you where this is. So here's the book. Oops, here's Reverb. If we go to the end, at the end of the very book, it says selected absorption coefficients. So we just go through and we can just look up some. It only gives us like a pretty small list there. I thought there was going to be more than that. But here's some absorption coefficients right here. And you can also just look this up. Just look up some absorption coefficients on the web. You'll find them all over the place. Most building materials will post their absorption coefficients. So we can see it goes from 125 to 4K. So let me get back to my presentation though. And let's take a look at them here in terms of this. So we see that it goes from 125 to 4 kilohertz. Now, of course, we can hear a lot higher than 4 kilohertz, and we can hear a lot lower than 125. But if we were looking at that Fletcher-Munson curve, the equal loudness contour curve, we can see that this is kind of the range. This is like the most sensitive range. And I would say the most sensitive. The most sensitive is going to be around between 1 and 4 kilohertz ish range. But for this one, it's going to be between 120, like where if we look at where it comes down and before it goes up. This 125 to 4 kilohertz, this is kind of like the dialogue range. And usually that's what when we say what's most important for us to be able to hear, the most important thing for us to hear is dialogue or like voice. We want to hear human voice. This is also the primary meat of the range of the human voice. But if you're doing a music hall, of course, it's going to go lower and higher. But this is where we care about for most of the stuff. So let's look at this. Let's take a look at some of these. Carpet heavy on concrete. So heavy carpet on concrete It's at 125 hertz. It's going to absorb, and we can, if we were to attribute this to say percentages, we would say this is 2% absorption. This at 250 hertz absorbs 6%, 500 hertz 14%, 1 kilohertz 37%, and 2 kilohertz 60%, and 4 kilohertz 65%. Interesting. So we can see that there's definitely a trend happening right here. And this goes back to what we've been talking about so far, if like understanding frequency versus wavelength. So V equals F times lambda. So that's when that's one of those equations I want you to remember outside this class for the rest of your life is V equals F times lambda. Because what that equation tells you is that what a frequency is, what the wavelength of a frequency is, or what the or if you got a wavelength, you can find out what the frequency is. Because we know that V equals 344 meters per second, that we can figure out what the other one is. Like if I give you frequency, you can find out wavelength and vice versa. And what we can see here is that a 125 hertz wavelength, if we want to do the math on that, we're going to find out that it's a fairly long wavelength. And as a result, this carpet is going to seem really thin relative to the wavelength, which is going to be really long. And therefore, the carpet doesn't really affect it very much because the wavelength relative to the carpet is such that there's a large differential. But as we get up here to 2 kilohertz, so remember, the 2 kilohertz is about 17 centimeters. So if that's 17 centimeters, 4 kilohertz is going to be about like yay. So that's the wavelength of about 4 kilohertz right there. And when we say that there's something like this and we have carpet, maybe that carpet is about like that thick, that carpet now the wavelength of the carpet, or the wavelength of the 4 kilohertz is relative to the carpet. It's pretty large. And so therefore it impacts it more. It affects it more. And that's well, to start this off, we're going to talk more about absorption coming up. And I don't know if it's next class or sorry, next week or whenever, but it's coming up, and we're going to talk a lot more about that thing. But we also talked about this a little bit when we talked about reflection. So if I want to reflect, or diffusion, I'm sorry. If I want to diffuse something, remember that the rule in that case was it's got to be about 1/7 of the wavelength for it to be effective. So in the case of this, if I've got 4 kilohertz wavelength right here, and I've got carpet that's this thick, I mean, we could say that it needs to be within 1/7 of the carpet. And of course, it's a gradient. It's not just yes or no. It's a gradient there. But we can say that the wavelength is important relative to the thickness or the size of the thing that it's hitting. That's an important concept overall. That's good. That's good to know. All right. So in this case, we did carpet, heavy on 40 ounce hair felt. So in other words, what we're doing is we're adding a layer below the carpet, a thick layer below the felt. And so what we did is we just upped our absorption quite a bit. In fact, it's 4-fold better at 125 hertz. It's still only 8%, but it's still 0.08%. And we could say at 250 hertz, though, we could see a massive jump right here. So it really, by just adding some felt underneath, or some, like, I don't know if we use this felt underneath carpet, but I'm imagining something that's like a carpet pad, that using a carpet pad is going to jump these numbers way up. Like at 500 hertz, now all of a sudden it's absorbing 0.57, or we could say 57%. So compared to 14% before, so this is significantly better. Well, I don't know if better is a term, but it's a lot more. And going up here, it kind of tapers off up here. So that's because it just kind of like just tends to taper off. And that's because, well, I don't know. I'm curious on that one right there. So acoustic tile, 1/2 inch thick. So this is like acoustic like tiles. Like I think that this is the ones they're talking about, like suspended ceiling ones. So 1/2 inch thick is 0.7, 0.21. And so this is pretty neat, like interesting. It doesn't absorb very well because it's only 1/2 inch thick. You know, imagine same thing on the 0.75 right here. So actually, the difference between acoustic 1/2 inch and 3/4 is not really all that much different. I mean, maybe a little bit over here, but it seems to be pretty close across the board. But it's pretty even. I mean, at the low frequencies, 125 and 250, it seems to be like pretty low. But then it hops up at 500 hertz. It's really good at absorbing 500 hertz. Pretty solid throughout this range right here. And so, yeah, so it's pretty uniform absorption right there. So block concrete coarse. So this is just concrete. So this actually, what's interesting about this is it absorbs 36% of low frequencies that hit it. And that presents a kind of a quandary. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in absorption section, but it's because it's porous. Because that air, because if like we're talking about concrete block, like cinder blocks, that's what they mean, cinder blocks, is that cinder blocks are porous, and therefore the air can actually impregnate and get through into the brick itself. And so therefore it creates a lot of friction and absorbs pretty good at low frequencies. In fact, it's better at low frequencies than it is, or arguably better at low than it is at high frequencies. Interesting. But if we paint it, so if I paint the cinder block, we lose all of that absorption. Now all of a sudden it becomes super hard, because before it was very porous and allows the energy to penetrate into the block and get absorbed in there. Whereas now if I paint it, it becomes a reflective surface. So this is like if you think of like a basketball gym. like, you know, I'm just thinking like junior high, high school type gyms, these are going to be really reverberant spaces. So that's why they sound like a super reverberant space. I mean, a basketball gym sounds like a basketball gym. Concrete floor, super reflective, right? 0.02. So that means almost across the board, it's between 0.1 and 0.01 and 0.02%. So say 1% to 2%. So concrete is a very good reflector. Glass, I didn't notice about that one. That's kind of weird. Look at that. It absorbs. Wait, you're like, wait, glass absorbs sound? That doesn't make any sense. So of course it reflects, like if you look at these higher frequencies, it reflects most of it. But what's interesting is at the low frequency here, it looks at this one right here, is that it's this 0.35. And what it's doing is it's actually transmitting. So when I said the glass, the sound energy hits the glass, but the glass vibrates and it actually passes through the glass and keeps on going. So even though it's not truly absorbing the energy, it's allowing it to pass through and it doesn't reflect back into the rooms. So it's what we call transmission. And so that's actually where this low frequency performance comes from. Kind of interesting. Same thing happens with here, gypsum board. So 1/2 inch on 2x4 studs with 16-inch centers. So this is a standard house, like standard house, stick house construction. And we see that it's 0.29. And the reason is because those walls actually resonate, they vibrate. And it allows the energy to pass through the walls and go into your neighbors. And this is why also, like if you have like somebody in the room next to you, and if you have standard 2x4 with 1/2 inch, this is really thin drywall with no insulation in between the walls, that you can hear the low frequencies coming through really good from the room next door. Part of it's because if it goes around the hall, we were talking about that before with diffraction, but if you have your doors shut, you can still hear it through the wall, and you only hear the low frequencies coming through the wall. And that's because those low frequencies actually can push and pull and transmit through the wall, where the high frequencies get reflected. Kind of interesting. But yeah, so hopefully this is kind of like tying in some of the stuff that you've experienced in your real life. All right, how are we doing on time here? Okay, so let's take a look at some other examples here. So these are taken from out of the back of the book. Like I said, you can look them up all over. They're all over the web for materials. But let's look at some of these. Like, so Orlex. This is the stuff you go buy at like either online or a Guitar Center or wherever. And again, we're gonna get deeper into how the physics of absorption materials work when we talk about absorption. But for right now, let's just take a look at these numbers here. So this is the wedge material right here. So we have, like, if you look at the Orlex website, which is where I pulled these from, they've got a bunch of different products that look at different ways. And so sometimes you'll see these in studios, but this is kind of like the go-to standard. You'll see the stuff everywhere, like that's like all over the place. I have my first batch of acoustic foam. I bought these right here, and they were amazing. By the way, like if you wanted, like, I think I've mentioned it before, but like what I used to do with these is I would buy. They came in 2 foot by 4 foot sections. And I would glue those to acoustic tiles, you know, the things that, like I was talking about, like you can go to Home Depot and just buy acoustic tiles. You can just take spray adhesive, spray this to the acoustic tile. And then what I did is I took some like just hockey grip tape and just wrapped it around the edge of the acoustic tile. Actually, I did that before I glued it. And then so it made a nice clean edge. And then on the back of that, I just put a couple pieces of wood just that I glued to the back of the wood tile. And then I put a piece of foam, so it's actually a soft surface. And they're super duper lightweight. And you can use a single tack nail to put them up in your room. And the beauty is that like if you're in a rental, it's essentially the size of a tack hole. And you can put these up all over your room, and it's super easy to pull them off. Or if you want variable acoustics, say maybe you're doing this in a drum room, and sometimes you want it to be loud, sometimes you want it to be reverberant, sometimes you want it to be less reverberant. You can take these on and off the walls, and it works really, really, really well. So anyway, so that's just a quick tip. We can talk more about that kind of stuff also throughout the rest of the semester. But let's take a look at, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this wedge foam right here, and we're going to change it and look at, as a function of depth, what happens when I make it thicker? Is it worth it to buy thicker foam? That's kind of the question we're asking here. So at right here, we can see that, yes, indeed, if I go at 125 hertz, it goes from 0.1, or we can say 10%, to 20% to 23%. So it jumps up quite a bit at the low frequencies, 250 to, because we can see a rise right here. So it does better at low frequencies, and it does even better. And then, you see anything weird happening right here? Strange, right? So what's happening here is like, you're like, well, isn't one a perfect absorber? Isn't that what I said before? So how can you have a better than 100% absorption? And the reason, so this is actually what it does, is what this says is that it actually acts like a larger surface than it really is. And that's because we have all these edges over here, like the edge effects of this sort of thing, allow it to actually almost act like a vacuum. So it is actually, you can get absorption coefficients greater than 1, which is really trippy to think about. but that it's actually almost acts like a vacuum. So what we could say is if I had a surface right here and it would say absorbs, like in this case, let's use 500 hertz. At 500 hertz, it's going to absorb 100% of any 500 hertz sound that hits it right there. But then if I were to say play from a speaker, it's actually going to act larger than the actual material, that surface area of that material it is. And that's because of these edge effects. I think I've never like really got the whole answer on this thing, but it's kind of fascinating. But what we can see here is though, so 1 inch is pretty thin, but 2 inch is kind of the standard. So this is what you'll find at most, like, in most situations. And then we also have 3 inch, which improves upon that. But we can see that, especially at 250 hertz, that's where it really kicks in and it really changes right here in this region right here. But the high frequencies, like the 2 inch does great job down to about 500 hertz. And then below there, it gets a little bit less down in this region right here, but still not bad. Okay. So what do these, like, I'm hoping that you have a kind of a grip on what absorption coefficients are. They're basically telling you how absorptive it is at a particular frequency. Now what we want to do is we want to take that information and roll that back into Sabine's equation, and so we can start building these acoustic models that we were talking about. So this is the equation that I actually want you to remember. This is at least one form of it. So this is the one I think of. Like when I think of Sabine's equation, I think of it as KV over SA. And this kind of goes back to when we were talking about the original, what Sabine was like researching, that he basically found out that it was surface area, volume, and absorptive materials. So we have K, which is going to be, again, our relational constant. So it's the same thing as before, nothing changed. V is the volume of the room. So if we're talking in a basic like box room, it's going to be length times width times height. And then we have this right before we had big A. So big A equals SA. And it's not SA. These are actually two separate variables right here. So it's S times A. So this is K times V. So, I mentioned also, I think in like the review for the exam, like there's a lot of different ways we can write multiplication. So what this does, when I say KV, it implies that K is times V. I could also write the asterisk symbol in here. I could also write the X as a symbol in here. And I could also write a dot sometimes as a multiplication. But the shorthand for math multiplication is just KV. So KV, implies K times V, and SA means S times A. So what we say here is S is the surface area, and A is the absorption coefficient at a particular frequency. So A is the absorption coefficient, S is the surface area. So that's what we need to do. So if I want to figure out the room, so basically, well, okay, I'm gonna show you the next iteration of this thing. This equation right here is the easy one to remember, but it's a little bit oversimplified. What we want to look at is taking it to the next level, because what we say is that there's a lot of different materials in a room. There's not just one, it's not just a uniform room. When we go into a space, there's usually going to have, like in the case, I'm in a room that has a concrete floor, gypsum walls, and like an acoustic ceiling in here. It's actually like insulation. So you're like, well, if I got surface area, so these are surface areas of the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, what absorption coefficient do I use? Well, the truth is you have to break that apart. And so you have to find out all the surface area of one particular material, multiply it by its absorption coefficient, then add all the surface area of another material and multiply by its corresponding coefficient plus another one. So you have, it's not, this is a simplified version of it. This is what it really looks like right here. So KV over S1A1 plus S2A2 plus S3A3. So in other words, what I'm saying here is this is the surface area of, say, let's use the example of the room I'm in right now. So I'm in a room that has a concrete floor, that's gypsum walls, and it has insulation ceiling. So what it's going to be is this is the surface area of the concrete times the absorption coefficient of a concrete plus the surface area of gypsum times the absorption coefficient of gypsum plus the surface area of the ceiling, which times the surface area of, the surface area of the ceiling, which is the surface area of this insulation material, times the absorption coefficient of that material. So you have to add up all the surfaces times their corresponding or correlated, corresponding absorption coefficients. And what's crazy is that each one of these absorption coefficients, there's 5 different values for like 125, 250, 500, 1000, 2000, and 4000 hertz. So all of a sudden it mushrooms very quickly into a very tedious thing. This is why spreadsheets are so useful. So you can use spreadsheets are really good at doing this. So if you wanted to set up your own little template spreadsheet for doing this, that would be a good idea. But I will say that I've done this, and I've built spreadsheets for this in the past. And of the last two studios I've built, I actually modeled out and I did all of this analysis because I know that I wanted my drums. So our drum rooms for our drums were amazing. Our drums sounded so good. In fact, they were so good that we started a company based off of just recording drums. Because like in our room, we never used any reverb, like any synthetic reverb. We only used acoustic reverb because we tuned our room to sound fantastic with drums. And the way we were able to do that is with this equation right here. So I was able to do this before I even walked, like we bought this warehouse that I'm sitting in right now, like many years ago. And when I was designing the space, I knew what the surface area, I knew what the volume, and I knew what the materials that were going to be made of. So I could tune the room and I could design the room to have a certain quality of reverb characteristics before I actually built it. And it worked. It's pretty cool. So, and the way I did that was using extensive use of spreadsheets. And it will tell you a lot about the character of the room. So right here, what I said, each surface area S needs to be calculated and multiplied by its corresponding coefficient, A, at and then parentheses said at each frequency, right? So this is the one, like this is the easiest way to remember it, but this is what you're actually going to do when you actually do the math here. So let's talk about how we do this, and we're going to run through this a couple times, and I'm actually going to do the math, walk you through this stuff because it's tedious, I know, but it's worth it. It brings it home so you understand, and this is like super like acoustician superpowers. Okay, so calculate the total surface area of each material type. Find the coefficients for it, plug it into the equation, and go. So also you need to find out the volume of it as well. Swap out the coefficients for each different frequency that you want to calculate. Spreadsheets are way easier to manage this. So the math isn't hard, but tedious and prone to mistakes. So let's do one right here. So I'm going to do this as an example. So example calculation 1. What is the RT60 of 1,000 hertz for a room that is 3 meter width by 4 meter length by 3.5 meters tall? Floor made of concrete, walls and ceiling made of 1/2-inch gypsum on 2x4 studs. So let's do this. I'm gonna like, so let's go, come here. All right, so I'm gonna do this on the iPad, and let's go through this. I'm gonna write this stuff down so I can remember it. So I'm looking for RT60 at 1,000 hertz, and so I'm going to draw this out. I like to draw it out every single time just because it helps me visualize what's going on here. So I have a 3 meter by 4 meter by 3.5 meters tall. And so what we need to do is the floor is made of concrete. So the floor is made of concrete, and then the walls and ceiling are made from 1/2-inch gypsum on 2x4 studs. So let's do this. I need to find out what the coefficients is. So I'm going to do this like A conc. So that's the absorption coefficient for concrete. And then the A of gypsum. Let's go take a look. Let's go see if we can find these right here. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go to my absorption coefficients right here. And I'm going to look for the absorption coefficient of concrete. Let's say concrete floor right here. And I said at 1,000 hertz. So where's 1,000 hertz? It's right here. So my absorption coefficient for concrete floor at 1,000 hertz is 0.02. So 0.02. And then for, do I have, I think it's maybe on the next one right here. Gypsum 1/2-inch on 2x4 stud 16-inch center. So this was 1,000 hertz right here. So it's 0.04 for at 1,000 hertz. So my A of gypsum is 0.04. Okay. Now we can get back into and do this thing. So let's work this out. So what I want to do is I want to figure out what the surface area. I should have written this a little bit. I should have organized this a little bit better, but that's okay. Let's do S of conc. So the surface area of concrete is going to be 3 times 4 because it's length times, or well, in this case, it's length times width. So surface area of this is going to be 12 meters squared, and that's because again, it's this times this that's going to give us the area of the floor. So let me move that away. And then what I want to do now is I want to find out what the surface area of the rest of the room is. So this is going to take me a little bit more. The surface area of the gypsum. So it's going to be 3 times. So the ceiling is going to be 3 times 4, which is 12. Plus, if I do 3.5 times 4. So I'm going to write this down. 3.5 times 4. is going to give us the side wall, and times 2 is going to give us the other side wall, plus 3 times 3.5, 3.5 times 3 for the front wall, and then multiply that by 2 to get the back wall. That'll work for us. So let me actually do this on a calculator. It's not that, like, I know this is probably like, whoa, this is so complicated. It's not. Once you go through it a couple times, it's not too bad. So I'm going to do 3.5 times 4 times 2 equals 28. So this is 28 plus 12. Let's do this one. The next one, 3.5 times 3 times 2, 21 plus 21. So 21 plus 28 plus 12 equals 61. So the surface area of gypsum, so I'm going to rewrite this down here again. Gypsum is 61 meters squared. Okay, so let's plug this into our equation. So it's going to go RT60 equals KV over S. I'm going to go S. Because I'm trying to write this a little bit smaller, I'm going to write this as A sub C for concrete and A sub C for gypsum, and the same thing for S sub C. So S C A C for concrete plus S G for gypsum plus the surface area of absorption coefficient for gypsum. Oh, the other thing that we don't have right now is the volume of the room. So the volume of the room, the total volume of the room equals 3.5 times 4 times 3. Length times width times height, right? So 3.5 times 3 times 4. Did I type that right? I think it's 42. Equals 42 meters squared. Sorry, my handwriting sucks, I know. All right, so let's try that. Let me just double check myself on that one. This is where that prone to failure thing is. 3.5 times 4 times 3 equals 42. Okay, cool. And all right, so let's plug it in. So now we just basically have to just plug and chug. So K is 0.161. Where did that 0.161 come from? Remember, K is a constant. K is always 0.161 times volume is going to be 42. I guess I don't need to do parentheses there. Then the surface area of concrete is going to be 12 times its absorption coefficient, which is 0.02, plus the surface area of gypsum, in this case, was 61, so it's a lot, 61 times 0.04 for the absorption coefficient. All right, so let's do this on the top one. So 0.161, I'm going to multiply that. 0.161 times 42 equals 6.7, whatever, 6.762 on the top. And on the bottom, it's going to be, so I'm going to multiply 12 times 0.02 times 0.02. It's going to be 0.24 over here. 0.24 plus, and then 61 times 0.04. It's going to be 2.44. So I'm going to add 2.44 plus 0.24 plus 0.24. So then in the denominator, so I have 6.762 on the numerator. And then on the bottom is going to be 2.68. So now I'm going to divide 6.762 divided by 2.68. And I get 2.5 equals 2.5 seconds. If I had another line, I would actually write that on another line. So I could say it's 2.5 seconds right there. That's a long reverb time for a space. So let's think about that. It's a 3 by 4 meter room. So if you want to think in feet, you could think about that kind of like being almost 10 feet by about 13 feet. About 14 feet, 13, 14 feet. So 12, well, if you just want to keep it simple, we'll just keep it like multiply this by 3. So that's a pretty good sized room. and it's gonna have a 2.5-second reverb time. That's a pretty long reverb time. And then remember, this is also RT60 at 1000 hertz. So if I want to figure out the true nature of this room, I would also go through and do the absorption coefficient for 125, 250, 500, 1000, 2000, 4000. And that will give me a different reverb time for every single frequency. And that'll really tell me about how the quality of that room is going to be. So if I have where the long reverb time at low frequencies and the short reverb time at high frequencies, that's what we're going to say is going to be like a warm room. And if I have something that's going to be something that has a lot of like high frequency that reverberate at high frequencies as well, that's what we call a brighter room. That's going to be like a harsher, a brighter, a colder kind of sounding room right there. All right, let's try another one. Let's do, I have a few of these here. Let's add them here, turn this one off, and edit this one here. Cool. Okay, what's the RT60 4000 hertz room that is? Oh wait, that's the one I just did. Oh. So what I did here is I want to look at it instead of thick floor, thick carpet instead of wool. So we're going to do the same thing again. So I can actually use a lot of the same information. I wonder if I can copy that. Let me try doing this. Can I copy this? I'm going to copy it. Copy. Cool. Paste. Cool. Cool. So what I'm going to do now is, this is what we did before. I'm going to erase. Oops. I'm going to work on this one, hide this one. No, that's not the right tool. Make this thing even bigger. There we go. I want a big eraser. So everything we did up there still holds, but instead of this one, it's going to be, let's shrink this down a little bit. This is going to be now surface area of, oops. Surface area of gypsum. That one all makes sense. This is no longer concrete, so this is going to be carpet. Let me get rid of all the concrete where it says everywhere. Oops, that one stays. I want this one gone. Okay, and this one goes away here. Cool. And that'll work. So what I want to do is I'm going to call this one carpet. Carp. So the absorption coefficient for carpet at 1000 hertz is going to be, this is 1000 hertz, and let's go back one page right here, find the carpet. Did I have it? Carpet. What did I say on felt? What did I say on there? On wool felt. Again, who knows what that is, but this is called hair felt right here. So the absorption coefficient for this one is going to be 0.69. So it's going to be 0.69 for the absorption coefficient. Cool. And now we basically do the exact same math we did before. So I'm going to go KV over SA. I'm going to write this. I'm going to try and write it over here. So I'm going to go 0.161 times, what was the volume again? 42. Divided by S. I'm going to do carpet. SC for carpet. Times A. C for carpet. Plus surface area of gypsum. G times the absorption of G. Cool. All right, so let's let me try and do this. I wish I'd written that down. I wish I didn't erase everything. 0.161 times 42. This is 6.762 on the top. On the bottom, it's going to be surface area of the carpet. It's going to be 12 times 0.69 plus the surface area of the gypsum, which is 60. Oops, 61 times 0.04. So let's multiply 12. 12 times 0.69 is going to be 8.2. So 7.6, there's 6.762 on the top. Then it goes to 8.28 plus, and 61 times 0.04, 2.44, 2.44. I'm going to add the two of those together. So 2.44 plus 8.28. So that what we get here is 6.762 divided by 10.72. So let's multiply that. 6.762 divided by 10.72. Wow. 0.63 seconds. So RT60 equals 0.63 seconds. Holy moly. So can you see what happened there? So at 1,000 hertz. So what we did is we had the same room. So we had a car, like this is what the difference is between throwing carpet in a room and not. So what I did there is I basically had a box room, a really hard surface, like standard 2x4 construction with gypsum walls. And then I have a concrete floor. And then what I essentially did is I put wool felt down and I put carpet down on there. And as a result, we went from 2.5 seconds. That's like, boom. That's maybe a little long right there. For that reverb time, down to. Maybe that's a little short right there. But that's how fast that killed that. So in other words, we can see at 1,000 hertz, we totally started absorbing a lot more of that. I mean, we didn't even talk about doing anything to the other walls. The gypsum walls, we left the same. In fact, it's probably pretty crappy if that was a standard. Like we're gonna have a lot of flutter echo going back and forth in those two axes right there. So if I really want to start treating the space, then I need to display the walls and add some other materials in there. But what we can see now is that we can start to predict how this is going to sound. And not only that, if I'm shooting for something. So basically I know how this room is going to sound before I go in there. I can go, okay, if I want it to have these certain particular characteristics, I can add these materials with these absorption coefficients to counteract certain frequencies. So maybe that there's like, in doing my math, for whatever reason, 125 hertz looks like it shows that it has a bizarrely long reverb time because of all the materials used in a space. That then I can go find an absorption. So go find in this list right here. I can go find something that absorbs really well at 1,000 or 125 hertz and add a lot of that material into the room. And all of a sudden now it's going to absorb a lot more of that room. So that's pretty cool. Like how this gives you this like magical ability to start doing these. And again, I think spreadsheets are the way to go. And if you're savvy with working with a spreadsheet, I would definitely build one out for this sort of stuff because it's way easier and it'll save your brain a lot of tedium on doing this because it's highly prone. You use a lot of paper writing this stuff out here. So yeah, so I think it's pretty fascinating what you can do with this stuff. So I have another one in here. I'm not really gonna have time to go forward this right here. So in this case, we're gonna see what's the RT60 of 1,000 hertz for a room that is 5 by 6 by 4 tall. It has full thick floor, carpet with wool felt, and wall and ceiling. So in this case, what we wanted to do is go, okay, well, if I keep the same materials, what changes if I make the little room bigger? And what you'll see, and actually, if we look at our equation right here, like if we go to our like the volume up here, the volume in the numerator, it gets much bigger and faster than this does down here. So what ends up happening is, what that means is that if I grow a room, the surface area goes up a little bit, but the volume goes up by huge. And as a result, my RT60 increases. And this correlates well with what we understand, that the larger the room, the longer the reverb, the longer that it tails, because that energy bounces around for a lot longer in a particular space. So we can go through and we can do all these calculations. It's pretty awesome. It's pretty stinking neat. So, but what we can see, that volume, and that's the point of that third calculation, is that the volume is what really defines the reverb time of a space. So yes, the surface area and the absorption coefficients play into it for sure, but volume is the one that really plays into it. So if I have a larger volume, it's going to have a much larger reverb time very quickly. So that's what I was going to show in that other one right there, that even if I move up my volume, you'll see that the reverb time goes up quite a bit. Even if the materials stay all the same in that particular space. So those are a couple different examples right there. This one right here, where like basically you have to go through and now of course not all the materials are shown on the appendices of the book. So the other question is, okay, like, well, that's just for the room. What about all the stuff in the room? Like, do I need to account for a desk or a person. And like the more you then yes, and if you want your model to get more and more accurate, you need to count up all the different surface areas and all the different absorption coefficients. Now there's a point where it becomes very not practical to do that. But things like, we know this, that if for anybody who performs in a concert hall, like if you rehearse in a practice concert hall and then you have a whole audience, a full house of people, the room sound changes big time. People absorb a lot of sound. So you need to account for that. So if you're trying to figure out the reverb time for a full room versus a not full room of people, it makes a big difference. You can look up the absorption coefficients of people. So you do need to figure out, like, if you're just going to start adding different things in there. Of course, like adding every single little surface, like, do I need to add the surface of my desk and add the surface of my people and all these other little tiny things? You're like, well, in the end, that's getting a little too granular. This is kind of good for approximations. It's not necessarily good for hardcore all the way out. This is kind of a rule of thumb. It'll give you an idea how it sounds. In truth, what this does is it gives you close, and then you have to go through, build it, and then you test it, and then you tweak it on the back end. And that's where we're going up with this next. So I'm only going to show this one here. We're not going to do the math on this one here, but there's a thing called the Eyring-Norris equation. And what this is usually done for smaller spaces. Those other equations, the Sabine's formula, that works really well for large rooms. But when we get to smaller rooms, like control rooms that are a little bit more dead, those numbers don't quite work out the way that they're supposed to. So this one takes into other things in here. So it has a different kind of version of absorption coefficients, and also does things like what does it have? Like, I guess it's just a little different way of looking at it. I've never in my life used this one right here, but it looks very similar, right? KV over minus S, which is surface area, times the natural log of 1 minus the absorption coefficient. But these are different kinds of absorption coefficients. So most published absorption coefficients are for Sabines, though. So a Sabine is S times A, if you recall, in the denominator. S times A is what we call a Sabine. But it's good to know. And then this is also kind of interesting here, is to look at the absorption. If we want to add in the absorption of air and add that into our model here, because we're not talking about this. If you have a gigantic concert hall, it is going to have some air thing. And so we can see the KV over A, which is the that's the Sabine right here, S times A. And then what they're going to do is they're going to add +4 and V. So M being the different values for different 2, 4, and 8 kilohertz, and then V is the volume of the space. So M depends on humidity. So this is basically going to give you, and this is some sort of number, some coefficient you have to look up, but it will allow you to figure out, because what we see is that air does absorb at higher frequencies. So for 2, 4, and 8 kilohertz, it does have a coefficient. And this also, like if you're talking to somebody from far away, their sound does get a little more rolled off, a little more muffled, and that's because of these high frequencies absorption coefficients. But I've never used that in any of my models, so but it's there and it's good to know. I'm not going to ask you about this, but I think it's just worth talking about right there. So that, my friends, in a nutshell, is going to be the working with Sabine's formula. I know that some of you are sitting there going, "Oh, this sucks," and it's not too bad. It will really come home if you actually practice this a few times, but it's worth it. It's cool. This is really powerful stuff. I'm not gonna like you are gonna have some homework questions and exam questions on this, but I'm not gonna make it ridiculously difficult. And if I do give you an exam question on this, I'm not gonna ask you to memorize these things. You can look them up. Nobody ever remembers this kind of stuff. What we're looking for is trends. And the more you do this math, the more it will come home that you to start to understand what's going on with this. Especially if you do it on a spreadsheet and you do that. And if you wanted to plot out like graphs associated with this, it's pretty cool. You can start to see trends happening. And that's where things like data visualization really come into play, where you can start to see these trends and you're like, oh, this is where I want to be. And so it helps inform your construction. So this is another aspect of acoustic consulting that's a big deal, and it's pretty awesome stuff. So, all right, we'll call it there because that is a lot to get through. I know that was already a bunch. So next step was we're going to look at how to start measuring and analyzing acoustic measurements. So that's next class. So until then, cheers. I will catch you all on the flip side.